Rummins by Roald Dahl. The sun was up over the hills now, and the mist had cleared, and it was wonderful to be striding along the road with the dog in the early morning, especially when it was autumn, with the leaves changing to gold and yellow, and sometimes one of them breaking away and falling slowly, turning slowly over in the air, dropping noiselessly right in front of him onto the grass beside the road. There was a small wind up above, and he could hear the beeches rustling and murmuring, like a crowd of people. This was always the best time of the day for Claude Cubbage. He gazed approvingly at the rippling, velvety hindquarters of the greyhound trotting in front of him. "Jackie," he called softly. "Hey, Jackson, how you feeling, boy?" The dog half turned at the sound of its name, and gave a quick, acknowledging wag of the tail. There would never be another dog like this Jackie, he told himself. How beautiful the slim streamlining, the small pointed head, the yellow eyes, the black mobile nose. Beautiful the long neck, the way the deep brisket curved back and up out of sight into no stomach at all. See how he walked up on his toes, noiselessly, hardly touching the surface of the road at all. "Jackson," he said, "good old Jackson." In the distance Claude could see Rummins's farmhouse, small, narrow and ancient, standing back behind the hedge on the right-hand side. "I'll turn round here," he decided. "That'll be enough for today." Rummins, carrying a pail of milk across the yard, saw him coming down the road. He set the pail down slowly and came forward to the gate, leaning both arms on the topmost bar, waiting. "Morning, Mr. Rummins," Claude said. It was necessary to be polite to Rummins because of eggs. Rummins nodded and leaned over the gate, looking critically at the dog. "Looks well," he said. "He is well. When's he running?" "I don't know, Mr. Rummins." "Come on, when's he running?" "He's only 10 months yet, Mr. Rummins. He's not even schooled properly, honest." The small beady eyes of Rummins peered suspiciously over the top of the gate. "I wouldn't mind betting a couple of quid you're having it off with him somewhere secret soon." Claude moved his feet uncomfortably on the black road surface. He disliked very much this man with the wide frog mouth, the broken teeth, the shifty eyes, and most of all he disliked having to be polite to him because of eggs. "The hayrick of yours opposite," he said, searching desperately for another subject, "is full of rats." "All hayricks got rats. Not like this one. Matter of fact, we've been having a touch of trouble with the authorities about that." Rummins glanced up sharply. He didn't like trouble with the authorities. Any man who sells eggs black market and kills pigs without a permit is wise to avoid contact with that sort of people. "What kind of trouble?" "They sent the rat catcher along." "You mean just for a few rats?" "A few? Blimey, it's swarming." "Never." "Honest it is, Mr. Rummins. There's hundreds of 'em." "Didn't the rat catcher catch 'em?" "No." "Why?" "I reckon they were too artful." Rummins began thoughtfully to explore the inner rim of one nostril with the end of his thumb, holding the nose flap between thumb and finger as he did so. "I wouldn't give thank you for no rat catchers," he said. "Rat catchers is government men working for the sodding government, and I wouldn't give thank you for 'em." "Nor me, Mr. Rummins. All rat catchers is slimy, cunning creatures." "Well," Rummins said, sliding fingers under his cap to scratch the head, "I was coming over soon anyway to fetch in that rick. Reckon I might just as well do it today as any other time. I don't want no government men nosing around my stuff, thank you very much." "Exactly, Mr. Rummins. We'll be over later, Bert and me." With that he turned and ambled off across the yard. Around 3 in the afternoon, Rummins and Bert were seen riding slowly up the road in a cart drawn by a ponderous and magnificent black cart horse. Opposite the filling station, the cart turned off into the field and stopped near the hayrick. "This ought to be worth seeing," I said. "Get the gun." Claude fetched the rifle and slipped a cartridge into the breech. I strolled across the road and leaned against the open gate. Rummins was on the top of the rick now and cutting away at the cord that bound the thatching. Bert remained in the cart, fingering the 4-foot-long knife. Bert had something wrong with one eye. It was pale grey all over, like a boiled fish eye, and although it was motionless in its socket, it appeared always to be looking at you and following you round, the way the eyes of the people in some of those portraits do in the museums. Wherever you stood and wherever Bert was looking, there was this faulty eye fixing you sideways with a cold stare, boiled and misty pale, with a little black dot in the centre, like a fish eye on a plate. In his build he was the opposite of his father, who was short and squat like a frog. Bert was a tall, reedy, boneless boy, loose at the joints, even the head loose upon the shoulders, falling sideways as though perhaps it was too heavy for the neck. "You only made this rick last June," I said to him. "Why take it away so soon?" "Dad wants it." "Funny time to cut a new rick, November." "Dad wants it," Bert repeated, and both his eyes, the sound one and the other, stared down at me with a look of absolute vacuity. "Going to all that trouble, stacking it and thatching it and then pulling it down 5 months later?" "Dad wants it." Bert's nose was running, and he kept wiping it with the back of his hand and wiping the back of the hand on his trousers. "Come on, Bert," Rummins called, and the boy climbed up on the rick and stood in the place where the thatch had been removed. He took the knife and began to cut down into the tight packed hay with an easy swinging, sawing movement, holding the handle with both hands and rocking his body like a man sawing wood with a big saw. I could hear the crisp cutting noise of the blade against the dry hay, and the noise becoming softer as the knife sank deeper into the rick. "Claude's going to take a pot at the rats as they come out." The man and the boy stopped abruptly and looked across the road at Claude, who was leaning against the red pump with a rifle in hand. "Tell him to put that bloody rifle away," Rummins said. "He's a good shot. He won't hit you. No one's potting no rats alongside of me, don't matter how good they are. You'll insult him." "Tell him to put it away," Rummins said, slow and hostile. "I don't mind dogs nor sticks, but I'll be buggered if I have rifles." The two on the hayrick watched while Claude did as he was told, then they resumed their work in silence. Soon Bert came down into the cart, and reaching out with both hands, he pulled a slice of solid hay away from the rick so that it dropped neatly into the cart beside him. A rat, grey-black with a long tail, came out of the base of the rick and ran into the hedge. "A rat," I said. "Kill it," Rummins said. "Why don't you get a stick and kill it?" The alarm had been given now, and the rats were coming out quicker, one or two of them every minute, fat and long-bodied, crouching close to the ground as they ran through the grass into the hedge. Whenever the horse saw one of them, it twitched its ears and followed it with uneasy rolling eyes. Bert had climbed back on top of the rick and was cutting out another bale. Watching him, I saw him suddenly stop, hesitate for perhaps a second, then again begin to cut, but very cautiously this time, and now I could hear a different sound, a muffled rasping noise as the blade of the knife grated against something hard. Bert pulled out the knife and examined the blade, testing it with his thumb. He put it back, letting it down gingerly into the cut, feeling gently downward until it came again upon the hard object, and once more, when he made another cautious little sawing movement, there came that grating sound. Rummins turned his head and looked over his shoulder at the boy. He was in the act of lifting an arm of loosened thatch, bending forward with both hands grasping the straw, but he stopped dead in the middle of what he was doing and looked at Bert. Bert remained still, hands holding the handle of the knife, a look of bewilderment on his face. Behind, the sky was a pale clear blue, and the two figures up there in the hayrick stood out sharp and black like an etching against the paleness. Then Rummins's voice, louder than usual, edged with an unmistakable apprehension that the loudness did nothing to conceal. "Some of them hay-makers is too bloody careless what they put on a rick these days." He paused, and again the silence, the men motionless, and across the road Claude leaning motionless against the red pump. It was so quiet suddenly we could hear a woman's voice far down the valley on the next farm, calling the men to food. Then Rummins again, shouting where there was no need to shout. "Go on then, go on and cut through it, Bert. A little stick of wood won't hurt the sodding knife." For some reason, as though perhaps scenting trouble, Claude came strolling across the road and joined me leaning on the gate. He didn't say anything, but both of us seemed to know that there was something disturbing about these two men, about the stillness that surrounded them, and especially about Rummins himself. Rummins was frightened. Bert was frightened too, and now as I watched them, I became conscious of a small vague image moving just below the surface of my memory. I tried desperately to reach back and grasp it. Once I almost touched it, but it slipped away, and when I went after it I found myself travelling back and back through many weeks, back into the yellow days of summer, the warm wind blowing down the valley from the south, the big beech trees heavy with their foliage, the fields turning to gold, the harvesting, the haymaking, the rick, the building of the rick. Instantly I felt a fine electricity of fear running over the skin of my stomach. Yes, the building of the rick. When was it we had built it? June? That was it, of course. A hot, muggy day in June, with the clouds low overhead and the air thick with the smell of thunder. And Rummins had said, "Let's for God's sake get it in quick before the rain comes." And old Jimmy had said, "There ain't going to be no rain, and there ain't no hurry either. You know very well when thunder's in the south it don't cross over into the valley." Rummins, standing up in the cart, handing out the pitchforks, had not answered him. He was in a furious, brooding temper because of his anxiety about getting in the hay before it rained. "There ain't going to be no rain before evening," old Jimmy had repeated, looking at Rummins, and Rummins had stared back at him, the eyes glimmering with a slow anger. All through the morning we had worked without a pause, loading the hay into the cart, trundling it across the field, pitching it out onto the slowly growing rick that stood over by the gate opposite the filling station. We could hear the thunder in the south as it came toward us and moved away again. Then it seemed to return and remain stationary somewhere beyond the hills, rumbling intermittently. When we looked up, we could see the clouds overhead moving and changing shape in the turbulence of the upper air, but on the ground it was hot and muggy, and there was no breath of wind. We worked slowly, listlessly in the heat, shirts wet with sweat, faces shining. Claude and I had worked beside Rummins on the rick itself, helping to shape it, and I could remember how very hot it had been, and the flies around my face and the sweat pouring out everywhere, and especially I could remember the grim scowling presence of Rummins beside me, working with a desperate urgency and watching the sky and shouting to the men to hurry. At noon, in spite of Rummins, we had knocked off for lunch. Claude and I had sat down under the hedge with old Jimmy and another man called Wilson, who was a soldier home on leave, and it was too hot to do much talking. Wilson had some bread and cheese and a canteen of cold tea. Old Jimmy had a satchel that was an old gas mask container, and in this, closely packed, standing upright, with their necks protruding, were 6-pint bottles of beer. "Come on," he said, offering a bottle to each of us. "I'd like to buy one from you," Claude said, knowing very well the old man had little money. "Take it." "I must pay you." "Don't be so daft. Drink it." He was a very good old man, good and clean, with a clean pink face that he shaved each day. He had used to be a carpenter, but they retired him at the age of 70, and that was some years before. Then the village council, seeing him still active, had given him the job of looking after the newly built children's playground, of maintaining the swings and seesaws in good repair, and also of acting as a kind of gentle watchdog, seeing that none of the kids hurt themselves or did anything foolish. That was a fine job for an old man to have, and everybody seemed pleased with the way things were going. Until a certain Saturday night. That night old Jimmy had got drunk and gone reeling and singing down the middle of the high street with such a howling noise that people got out of their beds to see what was going on below. The next morning they had sacked him, saying he was a bum and a drunkard not fit to associate with the young children on the playground. But then an astonishing thing happened. The first day that he stayed away, a Monday it was, not one single child came near the playground, nor the next day, nor the one after that. All week the swings and the seesaws and the high slide with the steps going up to it stood deserted. Not a child went near them. Instead, they followed old Jimmy out into a field behind the rectory and played their games there with him watching, and the result of all this was that after a while the council had had no alternative but to give the old man back his job. He still had it now, and he still got drunk, and no one said anything about it any more. He left it only for a few days each year at haymaking time. All his life old Jimmy had loved to go haymaking, and he wasn't going to give it up yet. "You want one?" he asked now, holding a bottle out to Wilson, the soldier. "No thanks, I got tea. They say tea's good on a hot day." "It is. Beer makes me sleepy." "If you like," I said to old Jimmy, "we could walk across to the filling station, and I'll do you a couple of nice sandwiches. Would you like that? Beer's plenty. There's more food in one bottle of beer, me lad, than 20 sandwiches." He smiled at me, showing 2 rows of pale pink, toothless gums, but it was a pleasant smile, and there was nothing repulsive about the way the gums showed. We sat for a while in silence. The soldier finished his bread and cheese and lay back on the ground, tilting his hat forward over his face. Old Jimmy had drunk 3 bottles of beer, and now he offered the last to Claude and me. No thanks. No thanks, one's plenty for me. The old man shrugged, unscrewed the stopper, tilted his head back and drank, pouring the beer into his mouth with the lips held open so the liquid ran smoothly without gurgling down his throat. He wore a hat that was of no colour at all and of no shape, and it did not fall off when he tilted his head back. "Ain't Rummins going to give that old horse a drink?" he asked, lowering the bottle, looking across the field at the great cart horse that stood steaming between the shafts of the cart. "Not Rummins. Horses is thirsty, just the same as us." Old Jimmy paused, still looking at the horse. "You got a bucket of water in that place of yours there?" "Of course." "No reason why we shouldn't give the old horse a drink then, is there?" "That's a very good idea. We'll give him a drink." Claude and I both stood up and began walking towards the gate, and I remember turning and calling back to the old man. "You quite sure you wouldn't like me to bring you a nice sandwich? Won't take a second to make." He shook his head and waved the bottle at us, and said something about taking himself a little nap. We went on through the gate over the road to the filling station. I suppose we stayed away for about an hour attending to customers and getting ourselves something to eat, and when at length we returned, Claude carrying the bucket of water, I noticed that the rick was at least 6 foot high. "Some water for the old horse," Claude said, looking hard at Rummins, who was up in the cart, pitching hay onto the rick. The horse put its head in the bucket, sucking and blowing gratefully at the water. "Where's old Jimmy?" I asked. We wanted the old man to see the water because it had been his idea. When I asked the question, there was a brief moment, when Rummins hesitated, pitchfork in mid-air, looking around him. "I brought him a sandwich," I added. "Bloody old fool drunk too much beer and gone off home to sleep," Rummins said. I strolled along the hedge back to the place where we had been sitting with old Jimmy. The 5 empty bottles were lying there in the grass. So was the satchel. I picked up the satchel and carried it back to Rummins. "I don't think old Jimmy's gone home, Mr. Rummins," I said, holding up the satchel by the long shoulder band. Rummins glanced at it but made no reply. He was in a frenzy of haste now because the thunder was closer, the clouds blacker, the heat more oppressive than ever. Carrying the satchel, I started back to the filling station, where I remained for the rest of the afternoon serving customers. Towards evening, when the rain came, I glanced across the road and noticed that they had got the hay in and were laying a tarpaulin over the rick. In a few days the thatcher arrived and took the tarpaulin off and made a roof of straw instead. He was a good thatcher, and he made a fine roof with long straw, thick and well packed. The slope was nicely angled, the edges cleanly clipped, and it was a pleasure to look at it from the road or from the door of the filling station. All this came flooding back to me now as clearly as if it were yesterday. The building of the rick on that hot, thundery day in June, the yellow field, the sweet woody smell of the hay, and Wilson the soldier, with tennis shoes on his feet, Bert with the boiled eye, old Jimmy with the clean old face, the pink naked gums, and Rummins, the broad dwarf, standing up in the cart, scowling at the sky because he was anxious about the rain. At this very moment, there he was again, this Rummins, crouching on top of the rick with a sheaf of thatch in his arms, looking round at the sun, the tall Bert, motionless also, both of them black like silhouettes against the sky. And once again I felt the fine electricity of fear, as it came and went in little waves over the skin of my stomach. "Go on and cut through it, Bert," Rummins said, speaking loudly. Bert put pressure on the big knife, and there was a high grating noise as the edge of the blade sawed across something hard. It was clear from Bert's face that he did not like what he was doing. It took several minutes before the knife was through, then again at last the softer sound of the blade slicing the tight-packed hay, and Bert's face turned sideways to the father, grinning with relief, nodding inanely. "Go on and cut it out," Rummins said, and still he did not move. Bert made a second vertical cut the same depth as the first, then he got down and pulled the bale of hay so it came away cleanly from the rest of the rick, like a chunk of cake, dropping it into the... Instantly the boy seemed to freeze, staring stupidly at the newly exposed face of the rick, unable to believe, or perhaps refusing to believe, what this thing was that he had cut in two. Rummins, who knew very well what it was, had turned away and was climbing quickly down the other side of the rick. He moved so fast he was through the gate and halfway across the road before Bert started to scream. The end.